Picture this. It's 1870, and Arizona Territory is quite literally a killing field. Now, when I say killing field, I don't mean some abstract historical concept. I mean places where people went to sleep in their beds and woke up dead, if they woke up at all. The Apache are doing something that no military manual of the time could even begin to explain. They're moving through landscapes that would break modern hikers with GPS and energy bars. We're talking about warriors who could cover 50 miles in a day through terrain so hostile that it actively tried to kill you just for being there. Imagine if the mountains themselves had joined the Apache cause, because in a very real sense, they had. At Camp Grant, Colonel Whitman is watching his entire strategy crumble. This isn't some minor frontier skirmish we're talking about. This is a complete breakdown of everything the United States military thought it knew about warfare. Whitman had tried the peaceful approach. He'd brought in Eskiminzin, leader of the Aravaipa Apache band, under a flag of truce. These weren't raiders. These were Apache trying to find a way to coexist, trying to find some middle ground in a world that seemed determined to offer them none. But peace, as it turns out, was the most dangerous thing Eskiminzin could have chosen. In April of 1871, vigilantes from Tucson, Americans, Mexicans, and Tohono O'odham warriors united in their hatred of Apache, descended on the peaceful camp at dawn. What happened next wasn't warfare, it was slaughter. Over 100 Apache, mostly women and children, were killed while they slept under American protection. The few survivors carried word of this betrayal into every hidden canyon and secret gathering place in the territory. You have to understand the psychological impact of this moment. Every Apache band, whether they'd been raiding or seeking peace, now understood that there was no sanctuary under the American flag. The moderate voices, the peace chiefs, the Apache who'd believed coexistence was possible, they were all silenced in one bloody morning. What emerged from Camp Grant wasn't just anger, it was something far more dangerous, absolute clarity about what survival required. And the revenge that followed? It made everything that came before look like children playing war games. Apache raiders began hitting settlements from Tucson to Prescott with a coordination and ferocity that left military observers convinced they were facing some kind of supernatural enemy. These weren't random attacks. They were surgical strikes designed to demonstrate that nowhere in Arizona Territory was safe from Apache retribution. Into this nightmare scenario rides a man who would change everything. His name is Al Sieber, and if you'd seen him walking down the street, you might have mistaken him for just another broken-down frontier drifter, 30 years old, carrying Confederate musket balls and Union cavalry saber scars from both sides of the Civil War. This German immigrant had done something remarkable. He'd survived America's attempt to tear itself apart, and he'd learned to speak the languages of survival: Apache, Spanish, English. But more than that, he spoke the language of the desert itself. Now, here's where the story gets interesting. The Apache warriors Sieber was about to face weren't just skilled fighters. They were legends walking among mortals. Cochise controlled the Chiricahua passes like some kind of mountain king, dictating who lived and who died in southeastern Arizona. Victorio commanded the Warm Springs Band with the kind of tactical brilliance that would have impressed Napoleon. And then there was young Geronimo, whose very name would eventually become synonymous with the impossible, a man who could disappear from the middle of a circle of enemies and reappear miles away, as if the earth itself had swallowed and then regurgitated him. These men moved through landscapes that broke cavalry horses' legs just looking at them. They appeared simultaneously in places 30 miles apart, as if they'd learned to bend space and time to their will. They struck settlements and vanished before soldiers could even saddle their mounts, leaving behind destruction and a growing sense among American forces that they were fighting ghosts. Sieber understood something that his fellow soldiers didn't. Standing outside Fort Apache, studying tracks that told stories most men couldn't even read, he saw the truth that would reshape American military thinking forever. These Apache warriors weren't using magic. They were using knowledge of terrain, of movement, of survival that had been passed down through generations of people who had made the desert their ally rather than their enemy. "Watch an Apache warrior run," Sieber noted, and you'll see something that defies everything you think you know about human movement. They run toe-first up rocky slopes that would challenge a mountain goat. They use Suicidal plant fibers to blur their prints, creating false trails that lead cavalry units in circles until their horses collapse from exhaustion. They travel at night by memory and starlight, navigating by landmarks that exist only in songs their grandmothers taught them. Meanwhile, the United States cavalry operates by European doctrine that might as well have been designed for fighting in the gardens of Versailles. Supply wagons that announce your position from 10 miles away, prescribed routes that your enemies can predict 3 days in advance, camps in valleys for water access, which happen to be perfect killing zones for anyone holding the high ground. When Seba proposed teaching soldiers to move like Apaches, Captain Bernard's response captured the military mindset perfectly. My men are soldiers, not savages. But here's the thing about pride. It makes a very poor shield against Apache arrows. Washington was demanding results, railroad surveys were grinding to a halt, mining claims were being abandoned, and entire towns were emptying as Apache mobility made American expansion not just difficult but impossible. Seba's quiet response to Captain Bernard would echo through military headquarters and eventually reshape how America fought its wars. Then your soldiers will keep dying, and Apaches will keep disappearing. The desert was about to teach the United States Army a lesson in humility that would transform not just how it fought in Arizona, but how it understood warfare itself. Because sometimes, the only way to catch lightning is to learn how to move like the storm. Now, finding volunteers for what Seba had in mind wasn't exactly like posting a recruitment flyer at the local general store. What he needed were men desperate enough, or crazy enough, to abandon everything they thought they knew about being soldiers. What he got were misfits and desperate men, the kinds of soldiers that regular officers wanted transferred to someone else's problem. There was Irish immigrant Private O'Sullivan, who saw this as his one shot at making sergeant before his enlistment ran out. Sergeant Hayes, a former Confederate cavalryman who was one court-martial away from a dishonorable discharge and a long walk home to whatever was left of Alabama. A dozen others with nothing to lose and everything to prove. Men who understood that sometimes the only way forward is through something that looks like certain destruction. Day one of Seba's training program shattered every assumption these men had about military dignity. Picture this: hardened soldiers who'd survived battles from Gettysburg to Glorieta Pass, stripped down to their undergarments and crawling naked through prickly pear cactus. And Seba, watching this spectacle with the patience of a man who'd seen worse, telling them, Apache children do this at 5 years old. You will learn, or you will bleed. This wasn't hazing. This was education. They climbed cliff faces barefoot, learning to grip rock with their toes the way Apache warriors had been doing since they could walk. They learned that pain was information, that their boots were a liability, that everything they'd been taught about movement was designed for a world that no longer existed in Arizona territory. The nights were when the real education began. Exhausted soldiers, tending to wounds that would have sent them to the infirmary under normal circumstances, listened to Seba teach them desert grammar, how afternoon thermals carry sound upward, making conversation audible to enemies on distant ridges. Why Apache never camp near water sources, because every predator, human and animal, eventually comes to water. Which cactus fruits provide moisture without causing the kind of dysentery that could kill you when you're 3 days from the nearest fort. Revolution comes through pain and humiliation, and these men discovered that everything they thought made them tough had actually made them vulnerable. They vomited eating desert fare, roasted agave hearts that tasted like sweet charcoal, pine nuts that seemed designed to tear up your throat, grasshoppers that provided protein when you couldn't carry enough dried beef to keep you alive. This wasn't punishment. This was survival. Seba forced them to run 30 miles, carrying only water gourds and dried meat, pursuing his Apache scouts who led them on false trails and doublebacks that revealed just how much they didn't know about the world they were trying to conquer. Private Morrison quit after collapsing from heat exhaustion, muttering something about signing up to fight Indians, not become them. But the others discovered something extraordinary happening to their bodies and minds. O'Sullivan learned to identify individual Apache warriors by studying the pressure patterns their moccasins left in different types of soil. Hayes mastered the Apache technique of running bent-kneed up steep slopes, distributing his weight in ways that let him move up surfaces that should have been impossible to climb. They began to see the landscape not as an obstacle to overcome, but as a language to learn. The first field test shocked everyone, including Seba. A raiding party had struck a freight wagon near Globe, making off with supplies and horses in the kind of lightning raid that had become Apache signature. Traditional cavalry units lost the trail at the Salt River, following standard doctrine that said you couldn't track anyone through water. Seba's unit continued on foot. For 72 hours, they followed signs that were invisible to conventional soldiers, a disturbed ant trail that showed recent passage, broken ocotillo spines that indicated direction and speed, horsehair caught on catclaw acacia that revealed how heavily laden the raiders' mounts were. They moved through terrain that should have been impossible for white men to navigate, reading the desert like a book written in a language only Apache were supposed to understand. When they finally intercepted the raiders at a hidden spring in the Superstition Mountains, something unprecedented happened. No shots were fired. The psychological impact was more devastating than any battle could have been. Apache leader Santos stared in absolute disbelief as dust-covered soldiers emerged from terrain that no white men should have been able to navigate, appearing like ghosts from landscape that was supposed to be their exclusive domain. Word of this encounter spread through Apache camps faster than smoke signals. The Americans, it seemed, had learned to grow shapeshifters. Men who could read sign like Apache grandfathers, who could move through desert without leaving traces, who understood that survival meant becoming part of the landscape rather than fighting against it. But this was just the beginning. What happened next would transform not just how America fought in Arizona, but how it understood the very nature of warfare itself. When General George Crook arrived in Arizona Territory in 1871, he carried orders from President Grant that were as simple as they were impossible. Pacify Arizona by any means necessary. Crook was no ordinary general. He'd fought Lakota and Cheyenne on the plains, had seen what happened when conventional military thinking collided with indigenous warfare. He took one look at Seba's experimental unit and immediately understood that he was witnessing a revolution. Against the furious opposition of traditional military officers who saw Seba's methods as degrading to military dignity, Crook did something that would have been unthinkable just months earlier. He expanded the program. But even more revolutionary was his next decision. He began recruiting Apache scouts to fight against their own people. Think about the moral complexity of this moment. Apache families, driven to the edge of extinction by American expansion, were offered a devil's bargain. Food for their children and protection from extermination in exchange for hunting down their own relatives. Some refused and fled deeper into the mountains. Others, watching their families starve, made the hardest choice imaginable. The cultural boundaries that had defined centuries of conflict began to blur in ways that left everyone involved questioning who they were becoming. Navajo Scout Deadshot taught cavalry soldiers night movement techniques using peripheral vision, showing them how to navigate in darkness without betraying their position. White Mountain Apache Alcacé revealed the secret of finding water by watching bee flight patterns, knowledge that had kept his people alive in landscapes that should have been uninhabitable. Picture American soldiers sitting around fires with Apache warriors, sharing jerky and learning to identify edible plants. Former enemies teaching each other survival techniques that transcended the artificial boundaries of race and nation. These weren't just military alliances, they were cultural exchanges that transformed everyone involved in ways that would echo through generations. The Tonto Basin Campaign of 1872 demonstrated just how completely the rules of warfare had changed. Crook's mixed units of soldiers and Apache scouts penetrated the Mogollon Rim country, a natural fortress that had been considered impenetrable by conventional forces. They lived on mescal and venison, moved in winter when traditional cavalry was huddled in forts waiting for spring, and appeared in places where Apache bands had felt absolutely safe for generations. These weren't the supply-heavy, predictable movements of traditional military campaigns. These were ghost units that could disappear into landscape and reappear where they were least expected, carrying everything they needed on their backs and living off knowledge that bridged two cultures of survival. At Salt River Cave, the new reality of this transformed warfare revealed its darkest implications. Seba's scouts positioned sharpshooters above a concealed Apache stronghold, using terrain knowledge that came from both cultures to create an inescapable trap. When the cornered fighters refused to surrender, what followed wasn't a battle, it was a massacre. 76 Apache died, mostly women and children who had thought themselves safe in a refuge that had protected their people for generations. Victory, it turned out, tasted like ashes. Sergeant Hayes, the former Confederate cavalryman who'd learned to move like an Apache warrior, drank himself unconscious that night, muttering to anyone who'd listen, "We've become what we fought." The moral weight of their transformation was becoming clear. In learning to fight like Apache, they'd also learned to see the world through Apache eyes. And what they saw was the systematic destruction of a people who had simply been trying to survive in their own homeland. But the transformation went deeper than tactics or moral complexity. These soldiers were learning Apache patience, the ability to wait motionless for hours, watching distant ridgelines for movement that might indicate enemy presence. They adopted Apache equipment, soft-soled moccasins that allowed silent movement, desert camouflage created using crushed minerals and plant dyes, a lightweight gear that let them move fast and far without the massive supply trains that had made traditional cavalry so vulnerable. Most profound was the mental change. Apache warriors fought as individuals within coordinated groups, making independent decisions based on terrain and opportunity rather than following rigid command structures. American soldiers began learning this fluid approach to leadership, abandoning the European model of hierarchical command for something more organic and responsive. Young Lieutenant Britton Davis captured this transformation in a letter home. "I no longer know if I command Apache scouts or if they command me. Perhaps that distinction no longer matters. The boundaries between teacher and student, between conqueror and conquered, had become so blurred that traditional military categories no longer applied. This wasn't just a change in fighting techniques. It was a fundamental shift in how America understood power, survival, and the relationship between human beings and the landscapes they inhabited. The desert was teaching both cultures lessons that would reshape the American military for generations to come. By 1886, the Apache Wars were effectively over, but not in the way anyone had imagined they would end. Geronimo's final surrender came not through some climactic battle worthy of dime novels, but through pure exhaustion. Seba-trained units had learned to shadow his band with the relentless patience of Apache hunters, appearing whenever the last free Apache tried to rest, raid, or resupply. They'd become so good at being Apache that they could out-Apache the Apache themselves. When Geronimo finally walked into General Nelson Miles's camp for the last time, his words captured the profound irony of what had transpired. "You have taken our powers and given them to your soldiers." The circle was complete. The very knowledge that had made Apache warriors seem supernatural had been absorbed, transformed, and turned back against its creators. But victory carried costs that went far beyond the obvious. Al Seba, now chief of scouts for the entire territory, battled alcoholism and nightmares that no amount of whiskey could wash away. The Apache scouts who had helped defeat their own people found themselves trusted by neither culture, too Apache for white society, too American for tribal communities that saw them as traitors. They existed in a liminal space, caught between worlds that no longer had room for their hybrid identity. The reservation system that followed military defeat destroyed traditional Apache life more thoroughly than any cavalry charge ever could. Children who should have been learning to read the language of the desert were instead forced into boarding schools where they were beaten for speaking their native languages. The knowledge that had made them the most effective light infantry in North American history was being deliberately erased, one generation at a time. Seba spent his final years training new generations of soldiers, his methods spreading throughout American military thinking like seeds carried on desert winds. Former students carried Apache techniques to the Philippines, where they used them against insurrectos fighting American occupation. The lessons learned in Arizona's mountains found new expression in tropical jungles and urban warfare. When World War I erupted, veterans of the Apache campaigns found themselves crawling through European mud, using patience and observation skills learned from desert warriors to survive in trenches that stretched across France. Military historians would later trace direct lines from Siba's training methods to the development of modern special operations forces. His death in February 1907 spawned conspiracy theories that persist to this day. Officially, Siba was crushed by a boulder during road construction work, a random industrial accident that claimed a man who'd survived decades of the most dangerous warfare in American history. But Apache workers on the project vanished immediately after the accident, and certain details never quite added up. Was it really chance that killed the man who'd learned their deepest secrets, or was it something more deliberate, a final settling of accounts that the official records would never acknowledge? Modern special forces trace their lineage directly back to Fort Apache, 1870. Rangers at Fort Benning still study movement patterns developed by warriors who could disappear into landscape as if they'd never existed. Navy SEALs learn patience from training manuals that descend directly from techniques developed by people who could wait days for the perfect ambush conditions. But here's the deepest irony, the one that military historians rarely mention in their official accounts. Apache philosophy, the understanding that landscape is teacher rather than enemy, survived the destruction of Apache military power. It lives on in American outdoor education programs, wilderness therapy courses, and survival schools that teach suburban kids to read nature the way their ancestors read books. Every summer, children at Outward Bound programs learn to move through wilderness using principles that Siba stole from people he helped destroy. They learn to read weather patterns, to find water in seemingly barren landscapes, to understand that survival comes from cooperation with natural systems rather than domination over them. And each year, young Apache from San Carlos and White Mountain reservations join elite military units, carrying ancestral knowledge full circle through a journey that spans more than a century. They move through Afghan mountains and Iraqi deserts, using techniques their great-grandfathers taught Siba, who taught the cavalry, who conquered their people. The desert remembers everything, including how empire learned to move like wind. In the end, perhaps that's the real lesson of this story. Knowledge doesn't belong to any one people or culture. It flows like water, finding new channels, adapting to new landscapes, surviving in forms that would surprise its original creators. The Apache showed America how to see the world differently, how to move through it with respect rather than force, how to become part of the environment rather than fighting against it. That transformation echoes still, in every soldier who learns that victory comes from understanding rather than overwhelming, in every outdoor enthusiast who discovers that the natural world is a teacher rather than a conquest, in every person who learns that survival requires becoming something new rather than clinging to something old. The desert taught both cultures that change is the only constant, that adaptation is the only truth, and that sometimes the only way to preserve what matters most is to let it transform into something unrecognizable. In learning to fight like Apache, America learned to be different than it had been. And in that difference lay both tragedy and hope, both ending and beginning, both death and rebirth under the endless Arizona sky.